Welcome to this Intimacy Coordinator panel as part of the BFI Woman with a Movie Camera Summit. My name is Rhianna Dhillon and I'm a film and TV critic, and I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Intimacy Coordinators Vanessa Coffey, Yarit, Ita O'Brien and Lizzy Talbot. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, it's lovely to be here.
So cool. I'm so excited about this. I mean, between you, you've worked on the most fabulous female-led successful TV series this year, from Bridgerton to I May Destroy You, I Hate Suzie to Adult Material, all stuff that I've just absolutely inhaled in the past year. So it's absolutely wonderful to see you. Some people might not be very familiar with the role of intimacy coordinator. Some people might know it really, really well. So it'd be really nice if we could start with your roots into the industry and how you got to where you are now. So Ita, let's start with you.
So mine has been a very organic journey. I was, I've been in this profession for 38 years now, and I was devising a piece of work looking at the dynamic of the perpetrator and the victim. And in that, I was looking at, as a facilitator and as the director of that device piece, I was looking at what practices and principles I needed to put in place in order to have a really robust and safe working process for my actors to be able to come in and be present, centered, grounded, in order to be able to enter into that exploration in a really healthy, safe way. And in that process, one of my colleagues, Meredith Dofton, who's the head of movement at Mountview, said, please come and teach what you're developing, because I have to note all the intimate content in the plays that my student actors are asked to do, and I'm aware if it's not done well. So that was April 2015 that I got asked to first start teaching the work. I was mentored by my the head of, or the senior lecturer in movement at Central, Vanessa, who had already had the inspiration to on watching a fight rehearsal, of seeing the time and the space that was given. So I co-worked with Vanessa and over the years developed a clear process. And then in 2017 started sharing the work with the industry, with Equity and the Person Managers Association, starting to share the intimacy on set guidelines. But the big shift came with the Weinstein allegations and in the subsequent Time's Up and Me Too movements. I got invited into the Time's Up UK Women's Committee, and that's where I shared the intimacy on set guidelines, which were endorsed by women in film and television. And then from there, the first job that then I was employed as an intimacy coordinator was Sex Education, and then Gentleman Jack, and the rest of the story is history.
Fantastic. And Vanessa, what about you?
My pathway in was, so where Ita talks about her path being organic, mine was a very strange pathway in. So my background was as a lawyer. So I was a lawyer first, and then I trained as an actor. And I also had a background in dance. So I'd done movement direction. So I had these three seemingly unrelated things bobbling about that I'd been doing. And then, I work at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. I worked there as a freelance lecturer. And it was through some ex-students of ours who started to come back to say, Vanessa, I know you were a lawyer. Could you have a look at this nudity rider for me? And can you explain it to me? And what exactly is kind of needed when I go on set with this? Is there any room for negotiating? And then we got to a point where it was like, can you do the negotiation for me with the production, particularly for people who didn't have representation at the time? So then it was a matter of negotiating some of that. I was then asked by one of those people to go on set with them to make sure that the nudity rider was, matching up with what we were seeing in the monitor. So that was the sort of the strange journey in, I suppose. And I started work very much in the theatre before transitioning into film and television.
Interesting. And Yarit, what about you?
Well, I started my journey first as a dancer. And I danced several years and then became a dramaturg of Hagit Yakira Dance Company, which deals with autobiographical material. And she's a dance therapist. So the material that she looks at is quite sensitive. But then from kind of dancing, I went into theater direction because I was interested to become a choreographer. But my love was in storytelling. So when I did my MA in theater directing, I realized that I'm interested in the body and in motion. And at the same time, I started learning stage combat. I became a stage combat teacher, started getting approached to do fight direction. As a female fight director, I find that a lot of my first jobs was to come in because the female actress needs support predominantly in a fight that is in a kind of kitchen drama scenario between the two main partners of that particular play. I got introduced into intimacy practice that was kind of formulated within America through Tonya Sina, through Lizzy Talbot when we worked. She's also a fight director and stage combat teacher. I'm sure she'll talk about herself. And then I went to do a formal training with a company that was back then called Intimacy Directors International, which then rebranded as Intimacy Directors and Coordinators. When I was working on a show for the West End, I was approached by, my agent was approached by someone to come and work on adult material. And that was the first show that I transferred the intimacy direction practice from stage onto the screen for intimacy coordination.
I see. It's all so fascinating. There's so much to dig into here. But Lizzy, I want to hear how you got in before we move on.
I came through this work originally as a theatre director. I did my master's in theatre direction and then trained as a stage combat teacher alongside Yarit for many years now. I won't give away anything. And so then using the knowledge that I had from stage combat, starting to look at, okay, well, there seems to be a big discrepancy between how scenes of violence are treated and how scenes of intimacy are treated, and started sort of researching that a little more. And then was really lucky to meet Tonya Sina, who'd been researching the role of like intimacy director and intimacy choreographer since, like 2004 when she wrote about it in her MA. So that was really exciting to get to meet her and start talking about the what comes next. It was great because she'd already come so far in her journey, and when we compared, it was like, oh, okay, well, you're doing this in America, maybe there's something I can do in the UK. And so set up Theatrical Intimacy, which was just at that point for theatre. And then the crossover came when I had an audition, an interview with Julianne Robinson for Bridgerton. And that's sort of like really where the floodgate opened. I'd done a little bit of work in the US, working as like just doing a little bit of stunt coordination, and alongside that intimacy work, like Kim Parent. That, and again, it's just looking at the differences between the protocols that have been implemented for fight work and the fact that there was just nothing for intimate practice, and how do we like level this playing field.
It's so fascinating how many different routes in there are actually, and there's no sort of normal way in. I know a big question has always been about how you work with directors, how you collaborate with directors, and how open or not they are to having you on set. So Ita, can you tell me a little bit about how you are able to manage that, I suppose?
So yeah, for me, the core of the work starts with serving the director's vision. Yeah, so it's absolutely all starts from there, and then serving the director's vision, serving the writing. So so they're explaining that, because the concern was in the early days that the intimacy coordinator would come in and take over at that moment, and it's like no. If you think of the role of the stunt coordinator or the choreographer, if you want a brilliant tango in Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, you're going to bring in that choreographer, talk to them about the vision, talk to them about the energy of the scene, talk to them about what music you're going to use, and then choreograph with your dancers. The same with the fight. So it's exactly the same with the intimacy coordination. So speaking to the director, going, okay, what do you want? What's your vision? What's written on the page is one thing, but of course everybody can have a different image of what that might mean. So asking, speaking to the director, very often inviting them to, if they don't do it already, to create storyboards, particularly in film, because of course an intimate scene isn't just what you choreograph, but where the camera's placed that can make or break, an intimate scene, can make something really exciting or can make something very vulnerable for an actor. most important thing, you know, in a way, the newest thing is agreement and consent. So once you go, okay, great, this is what the shape of the scene is, then let's agree touch, let's agree what is not okay for you, what your nudity requirements are, what your boundaries are regarding touch, what your boundaries are regarding, you know, what you're happy to do simulator sexual content wise, and then choreographing really clearly, really openly, with the actor feeling empowered and autonomous with everything that is in their agreement and consent, giving a clear physical structure within which then, once it's in front of camera, they're free personally. They know that they're happy where they're being touched. They're happy where they're touching the other partner. They know that the director's vision has absolutely been able to be nailed.
And I'm always intrigued as to, there are so many different kind of behind the scenes roles where people come on board at completely different points, and it all depends on the project as well. Vanessa, at what point do you try to come on board a project, or what is the kind of the best time? Is it at script level, actor level, you know?
It's a really good question, Rhianna, because, and I think, you know, I'll speak for all of my colleagues here, we are brought on at very different times within different productions. Sometimes it will be a call the night before something's due to go on, with somebody saying, we need some support tomorrow. I mean, that has happened, definitely. Yes, or where something has been in rehearsal actually for a long time and something's gone wrong within that rehearsal process, and an actor is feeling particularly vulnerable and one of us gets brought in. The ideal, because we are a head of department like any other, the ideal is that we're actually there right from the outset. So, you know, that we are having conversations, we're able to talk with the writer, we're there for those conversations with the director, with the actors, listening to how we're best going to tell that piece of story, because it's, you know, the intimate moment should be essential, because if it's not essential, why is it there in the first place? If it's not serving story. So we absolutely need to be in from the get-go, in my view, rather than in there at a later stage to kind of firefight. That would be my suggestion.
Absolutely. And just what you were saying about rehearsals, if you do have a director who doesn't like to rehearse, but you feel rehearsal is necessary for a scene for the actor's sake, how do you have that conversation without the director feeling like you're treading on their toes?
So I personally haven't had a situation where a director has turned around and said, I don't want to rehearse this particular scene. Because it's always been part of the agreement that I've had because most of us are interviewed for our jobs, which I think is also really important in a way that a director and a producer gets to know who this person is who's going to be coming on to work with them, because we are collaborating with them and they need to know that they're going to be able to collaborate with this person who's coming in. So as part of that initial conversation, I would always talk to them about what my process is. And part of that is about ensuring there's time set aside for rehearsing these scenes, rehearsing the scenes before the day, and also revisiting the choreography that we've agreed on in situ on the day before we go for a shoot. So that's all been pre-agreed usually with the director. So thankfully I haven't had that situation, Rhianna, of suddenly feeling like I'm treading on somebody's toes. Yeah.
And Yarit, you touched on this, obviously. You are a fight director as well as an intimacy director. And I was wondering about the parallels that come through that. Lizzy, do feel free to jump in as well. But just, yeah, you know, why do those two go so naturally together?
Both of them look at content that has very high emotional requirements out of a performer. There is some sort of level of resilience that is needed for that kind of performance. And therefore, for both of those processes, we look at kind of trauma sensitive practice, basically. What Ita was talking about, having those early conversations, informing the performers what it is, what's the scene, what's the vision, how are we going to shoot it. All of that allows the performer to have time to have agency and choice around the actions, and to prepare their body, both physically and emotionally, to know what's coming up. What Vanessa was talking about, rehearsal, is part of that. The more they have the ability to rehearse, it preps their body and it preps their psychological state for the day itself. They know what's coming. And obviously on the day, there are other factors there's tiredness, there's very early calls to get costume, wigs, oh my God, that's an early call. If there's nudity and there's makeup on the body, again, that's an early call. Considerations around what to eat. If there's nudity, that will affect their intake of food before that day. They might choose to actually fast or do a particular diet. So that changes their kind of emotional resilience and where they're at emotionally when they come onto the set. So when we're looking at intimacy scenes, whether the content is consensual or non-consensual, all of the prep that went into it allows us to mitigate the risk. Because at the end of the day, intimacy scenes, just like fight scenes, we're mitigating risk by allowing so many factors in the way to assure a conversation, assure consent, and information being passed between the performers to other departments, from the director to the performers, and vice versa. But also what we don't necessarily talk about that much is also the kind of discussion we have with actors after the day of shoot. Different intimacy coordinators have different practice about post-shoot tasks. Some of them do feedback sessions with actors. Some of them check in via text or a phone conversation. Sometimes actors prefer emails. So there is kind of an opportunity for feedback, especially if that performer is going to be performing more intimacy. If they want to slightly adapt the process, change, ask for more things, ask for less things, that allows that space and time and breath to have those conversations.
That's so interesting, the kind of the mental well-being that carries on with your jobs after something is wrapped. That feels incredibly important.
Yeah, it's absolutely that. It's you know, with when Michaela, you know, at the BAFTAs, you know, she was saying the internal devastation of the actor. I promise you, practically everybody, when I say when's the work been done well and when has it been challenging, and nearly everybody will have a story. And it also, you have that thing of people go, oh no, actually I've been fine, and then as the stories have gone around, they go, oh, actually no, I remember that time, and you just shore yourself up and you carry on. And then the next thing is, that's why, you know, of course you're going to check out, or were you happy with the work today? Check in at least 20, you know, wait 24 hours, because it's not till very often someone slept on it that they might wake up and go, oh, do you know what? You know, in that masturbation montage, I actually didn't see playback, and actually I'm now feeling vulnerable. You know, so it's those kind of things. I did a panel discussion with Sophia Helen, who's played the lead in The Bridge at the Berlin Film Festival, you know, the Berlinale. And when we were doing the introductions, she said every single time she's done an intimate scene, it has cost her.
Ooh,
yeah,
that's
I
very
know.
powerful, yeah.
That's pretty powerful, and that was a response of the audience as well. A feeling that someone of her stature, of her status, of her experience in the industry, and that was still her experience of working with intimacy.
I mean, on that very thing, I think there's something, you know, Brene Brown, who I absolutely love as a thought leader. I mean, she talks about a shame hangover. That once somebody has been vulnerable, that they can experience something called a shame hangover. So it is about an opportunity to check in, you know, a while after that scene has happened, because that's going to be, it's not necessarily in the moment when somebody experiences that shame hangover, it's a couple of days later. Yes. So that's when we need to be there to go and check in again.
That's so interesting. And well, I suppose, you know, you must have to approach certain scenes differently. How do you approach a solo sex / masturbation scene versus a, you know, 2+ person sex scene, Lizzy?
I think the difference really is that doing solo stuff is incredibly difficult because you don't have someone to bounce off, to work with, to be in the moment with. Whereas obviously, you know, when there's 2 or more, you know, it becomes like quite a team effort at that point. You know, there's a lot of communication between the two. You know, you're working on mutual consent, mutual boundaries, and you're facilitating, as an intimacy coordinator, you're facilitating something which has more of like a group feel, like a group workshop feel. Obviously, you'll work with those actors individually beforehand, but that, you know, there's now 2 people to navigate. with solo work, you're looking at someone who's in an incredibly vulnerable position, because you've got to ensure that there is a distinction between actor and character. And one of the things that you can do, even as a director, and many directors know this, is when you're referring to the character and what they're doing, it's very conscious that you're referring to what's happening as the character.
Mm-hmm.
And so the character is doing and the actor is simulating.
Right.
And that separation helps to distinguish the personal and professional,
Mm-hmm.
which is very complicated in our industry, where for so long those two have been so intertwined.
Yeah.
So how do you tease apart something that has been so ingrained?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very simple way of making sure that the actor is not feeling like they are performing what they might do in the bedroom, or performing like something very personal to the entire world. And having a really candid discussion with actors about hey, once it's on screen forever.
Yeah.
There's no taking that back. It's slightly different if you're working in a different medium, but definitely if you're working with anything on screen, it's once it's out there, it's out there.
It makes absolute sense. Vanessa, I wanted to ask you, in I Hate Suzie, there's an episode with Suzie fantasizing about having sex with multiple people, and it's all really brief, but it kind of got me thinking about whether an intimate scene, whether it's 3-second flash with one, say with Billie Piper and one other actor, or a much, much longer scene, are you able to approach it with the actors in the same way? Do you have time to do that?
Yeah, because again, hopefully you've been given that rehearsal time in advance. So because it's still about, even if it's a flash, we still need that person to be completely in character and to know what's happening in that moment for that flash to mean something.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, whether it's a long masturbation scene or whether it's cuts between sections of a masturbation scene, it's still really important that we're telling the story for that individual moment, or that we've got an arc that takes us. If we've got something that's going to last an incredibly long time, and I had something on stage that was a 5-minute masturbation piece, so we can't just have somebody doing the same action for that whole 5 minutes, because it's not realistic. It doesn't tell us anything as the audience. So there needs to be an arc to that story, to that, to that physical journey right from the start to finish. So yeah, whether it's a couple of seconds or whether it's a couple of minutes, we have to map out exactly what that thing needs to tell us in that moment narratively.
And what kind of intimate props do you use to physically protect the actors? Do they differ from stage to screen as well?
So we'll all have different things, I think, that we use, and we have conversations actually about the kinds of things we use. Like, oh, is this something that you use? Okay, yeah, I found that that's useful or not
Mm-hmm.
for me. So I tend to use quite small cushions, for example, if we're in simulated sex, and they're made from like underwear, but with cotton wool inside it, like woolen padding essentially in it, so that it squashes down quite small, but actually make sure that there's no pubic bone to pubic bone contact that's possible between the actors. But that's for a simulated sex where and that's, I'm talking about just heterosexual sex at the moment. So that's something that I would use. I know some of my colleagues use different materials and different fabrics within some of these scenes. Also, I mean, we've got options to use silicone inserts in various pieces of, so for example, you might have a silicone insert that the male is using inside, like a hebu, so that the bit that sits across the male's genitalia, some people would prefer to use it and some people don't. So we need to have a conversation with people about preferences. And so we've got the modesty garments on one hand and we've got the barriers on the other, and they're two things in addition to the choreography that keep people safe.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm sure my colleagues will have something other than those cushions.
Well, do chip in. Yeah.
I mean, John Lewis would be very surprised to know how many sex scenes they've had the pleasure of being part of. I won't mention it because I don't want it to sell out. I'm quite worried about that in lockdown. But yes, I'm very pleased that they've been part of so many unbeknown to them sex scenes that have happened, which is great. And essentially it's all come from playing around. When we've all been researching, I'm sure we found like amazing stuff that works that you wouldn't necessarily think, but it's all come from a play and research and figuring out, okay, how does this work? And I think Alicia Rodis came up with the very sort of like first barrier back in 2016, 2017, and it's called a vajoga, which is literally like a piece of yoga mat that's almost like a big like almost like a sanitary towel shape and size, probably a bit bigger, but it would like flop underneath and go over the top of another actor. So it's sort of like in a U shape between someone's legs. And again, it provides protection between genitalia, which is what we're all focused on. And I've got something that I use, which is like a 3 barrier system, so that, if you've got 2 people simulating sex, you've got each of them has like a barrier attached to a modesty garment, and then they've got an additional modesty garment. And the concept behind it is that if one fails, then if one flies out unexpectedly or something, then you've got like backups. And so again, you're not going to have that genitalia to genitalia contact, which is what we all want to avoid at work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Eata's are going to do a little practical demonstration. Are you?
Yes. Here's some I made earlier.
Your blue Peter badge is on its way.
That's right. I was doing an interview the other day, so I had them all here. So yes, as Vanessa said, sort of I developed working, with actually using, underwear and, working with the wardrobe department and getting them to sew those up and then filling, stuffing them with lamb's wool. So for example, like these shaped ones, as you say, are really good in putting those sort of, in between. Particularly, we talked about period work, so very often there's moments under a skirt. So what's really good is if the actor is wearing flesh-coloured shorts, and then you actually put that inside, so that again gives a lovely barrier. So moments of oral sex, under a skirt, that and it's really lovely, and it means that you've placed that sort of there, and the actor's feeling really, really well, a really good barrier. This is a very good one for sex sitting astride. So yes, so when I work, and what I try to do, particularly on long-running TV series, is I now work with the wardrobe department, and they make up a whole series of these for the main actors who are going to have most of the intimate content, and so they can have then their plethora of genitalia cushions that they can have then for the rest of their career.
That's fantastic. I love they get to keep those.
Mantelpiece keepsakes.
Yeah, it's interesting how our playing around with our own practice has kind of led to different instruments of dare I say instruments of pleasure. Myself and a colleague created a company called Intimask that is the first company to create modesty garments specifically for simulated sex scenes and nudity that a lot of intimacy coordinators and costume departments now buy and use, because we found that costume departments don't want to waste their time, and producers don't want the costume department to waste their time making things that are not going to be seen. So the company has been the first to create a large range of skin tones for modesty garments, because until then it was very difficult to find different range of browns and different range of beige.
Am I right in thinking you were the first intimacy director to be credited on the West End on Death of a Salesman, which is that's a very cool kind of credit to have. On stage where scenes are happening multiple times in front of a live audience, how does that change the way that you might approach something, or what might you try to encourage or discourage?
The practice in itself is slightly different. I would say the first thing to consider is sustainability. If a performer has to perform at 8 shows a week, it has to be something that is comfortable in their body, they can immediately go in and out of, and they can also leave and separate and de-roll from that at an end of the show. There's also considerations, much bigger considerations around sustainability of modesty garments and costume, because at least on set, you can tape tape a modesty garment to a costume or a period costume, and it will keep for a couple of takes. And then the costume department is less precious of it tearing a tiny bit of, I don't know, sewing. But in theater, you can't do that, because then the costume department will have to sit down and re-sew everything every single night. So that's the sustainability aspect. I find personally that the intimacy work in itself, you get, dare I say, deep down and dirty a bit more on stage, because the rehearsal process is longer.
Right.
If you're between kind of 4 to 5 weeks rehearsal, then you do one rehearsal session with them. They start getting used to the material. The next time you come in, they have new ideas, they have different ideas, they want to modify slightly in the style. You kind of rework everything each time you arrive, which means that also on the emotional sustainability scale, they're slowly getting used to it. On set, it's not exactly the same. Screen actors need to be able to give 120% performance in whatever physically they're asked to do. So it needs to be comfortable for them. They need to be able to immediately do it. But sometimes there are more repercussions, because they immediately do it, they do it a couple of takes, and then, like Ita was talking about, the triggering can come a tiny bit later.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas in theater, you have more time to process.
I think just jumping into what you were saying there, Yarit, because I think it is really interesting as well with when over time, when people, they don't even realize sometimes they're changing some of the choreography. So it's also about, in the same way that we would with fight direction on stage, people run it every night before they do it, not necessarily full out, but just actually marking it through that they do the same thing in terms of the intimacy, so that it doesn't vary, and they can check in with each other. The two performers can check in with each other, and also so that there's a stage manager or somebody else who's present there, who's overseeing that, who can see if there are any physical differences between what we've agreed and what's actually going on. And then, as Yarit says, you can also, you might have to go in and rework some moments of it if the scene has evolved in some way, particularly on a long run of something.
This is something that I maybe should have talked about earlier, but please all do jump in. But Lizzy, I wanted to ask, especially because there has been so much talk about the chemistry between the two leads in Bridgerton, and we know that that doesn't just happen instantaneously. So can you tell us about some of your techniques to break the ice between actors having to do intimate scenes in the first place?
Yeah, I think especially what Reggae and Phoebe have spoken about is that it's I don't think it just falls down to one department, and it certainly didn't in Bridgerton, because obviously, like, we had the wonderful Jack Murphy who did so much dance choreography with them, and of course, like, that's already going to help with chemistry, when doing those dance rehearsals. There was also etiquette lessons, and things that they had to do together there, and so I think, I don't want to say like it takes a village, but I think it's definitely something that's like far more collaborative than just sort of like two people just creating it somehow in a room together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
But I think for us, one of the key things that we really found, because we had quite an intensive rehearsal period, because the majority of episode 6, and in fact all of the honeymoon sequence, was actually filmed in the first like couple of months of filming. So it all happened in the summer, but we were lucky enough to have about a 6-week rehearsal period, and so it was great. We went through like nearly every single scene during that rehearsal period, just to give it like a skeleton. And I think the key was just we just had so much fun, and of course, like, they would put forward great questions, because the actors are going to know their character better than anyone. Like, they really understand. They have this deep down knowledge. They study them every day. They work with those lines all the time. They've done all their sort of research. And so I think that it was just wonderful when they were putting forward suggestions about what might happen here, and like how this could possibly come about, and facilitating that and collaborating with them. And it became like quite almost a group process. It wasn't just in the intimacy world, because there was connection and chemistry in so many scenes, even when they're from their beautiful dancing to like riding horses and all this promenading. It's just it's lovely to see that. And I think that to put this might be sort of going a little bit off topic, but in terms of like it takes the village, it's the same with that sort of advocacy work. Like the intimacy coordinators can't be the only ones being seen to advocate for actors, for like all time. Yes, we're certainly part of it, we are absolutely part of the process, but I don't believe that, I'll just speak for myself here, I don't believe I've done a very good job if like the rest of the industry doesn't rise with that. And so we have to look for something that is far more far reaching, and advocacy across the industry needs to rise. And it's not something that it's only the intimacy coordinator's job to facilitate. Everyone needs to be feeling that they can advocate for everyone else, and the space needs to be created in a way that people feel like they can do that.
I just wanted to follow on from that, because it absolutely, I mean, like historically it has been the wardrobe department before the role of the intimacy coordinator. It was the wardrobe department who invariably had the ear of the actor, who would be the ones that they'd be saying, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing today. What am I supposed to be wearing? Nobody's spoken to me about this. Help, sort of thing. And so it absolutely has been the wardrobe department before now who have really supported the actor. And here's us saying that, okay, we have developed genitalia stuff and all the rest of it, but the wardrobe department have been there historically, supporting that actor, supporting them with that process of being covered until it's action, pulling robes, knowing that then on cut that it's covered. I just worked last week with the most amazing first AD, and again she woman who's been in this industry for like 30 years, and when she started out, there were very, very few female first ADs. And she was, again, she's another person that we know, she was speaking to me about her advocacy, her work in trying to make sure that that actor and actress were taken care of when there wasn't these protocols.
Hair and makeup and too, as well. Because, if you sit in that chair for 3 hours having your hair and makeup done, you're going to be really familiar with that person. You're going to, the likelihood is that you're going to trust them. You're going to explain, or you're going to say, I'm feeling really nervous about this scene today. And of course, like, so many departments have stepped up and stepped out for actors before we've come along. And, we do have a process and we do have all of this stuff, but we have got pieces of things that people have been doing before we arrived. And so making sure that people, one, have had the credit for what they've done beforehand, and also feel like a burden has lifted for work that they haven't been paid to do previously.
That's such a lovely way of putting it, Lizzy. And this is it. And this is where I feel our role, so a certain aspect of our role is just knitting the different departments together, who have all invariably been pulling together with best intentions to take care of the actors, to make sure that that pathway through to making the best scene, from producer to director to wardrobe to costume to the set manager, who's going to make sure that the hot room is set up right next to set, with a heater if you've got a bath scene going on, your SFX people who are going to make sure that the water for the bath has got the proper level of chlorine in it, so the proper temperature and all those sorts of things.
I think that's the reason, it's really important that the role is called, to me, intimacy coordination, for that very reason, because it's about coordinating all of these departments coming together. And I mean, yes, we talked just there about first ADs, and they are worth their weight in gold when you're looking at, putting in place closed set protocols. There are so many kind of heroes that have come up through, but as my colleagues here have said, it hasn't fallen to one person. A lot of what we do has fallen across several departments, and it's really lovely that we can hold that space now.
And I think, Vanessa, what you're saying about the terminology is really important, because intimacy coordinator is one thing. Intimacy coach, which sometimes we get named, is something. And I see everyone's reaction from like, so Yarit, Vanessa, Ita are all shaking their heads. The reason is, and I'll let you know now, is because we get emails from people general members of the public who assume that what we do is something that we can help them with in their personal lives and in their own bedrooms. And so our email inboxes will occasionally come up with these sorts of things, and it's because of the name. Intimacy coordinator is, you know, similar to stunt coordinator. We work in the entertainment business, and we work predominantly with actors. That's what we do. We create storytelling. Intimacy coach is going to be someone who's like, you know, maybe therapist, sex therapy based, who is going to work with someone in their personal lives to improve, like, you know, maybe interpersonal sexual relationships, which is something that we absolutely don't do. I had to explain this to a documentary a couple of weeks ago that wanted us to come in and facilitate something that was between a personal couple, and I was like, that's not what we do.
Absolutely, that's the next thing, is that, you know, people say to me, oh, I'm a sex expert, so I'd be a really good intimacy coordinator. I'm going, actually, the last thing you need, or the last thing we look at, is actually the sexual content. We're looking at serving and facilitating the actor-director process, serving the storytelling, serving the text. And just like if someone's, you know, lovely Daniel Day-Lewis spent a year learning how to be a cobbler, the content is then what the actor, the director, and us as intimacy coordinators then should research. What is this moment, you know, of intimacy? Just as I've done. Where are we? On Gentleman Jack, I had my whole lesbian handbook, you know, which is a brilliant book, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to research that. I'm going to read all of Anne Lister's diaries, you know, in order to research that detail. You know, we are not sex experts.
Because of where we're positioned in facilitating both discussions around the intimacy content and the storytelling, there is a certain level, at least I see it in my work, of slight activism, and that's in looking at the representation. And if I feel like I'm the wrong representation in that particular story, then bringing, now there's intimacy coordinators from the transgender and LGBTQ plus community, and intimacy coordinators that are people of color, and from the global majority. I think it's really important to also kind of bring that as part of raising the awareness and making the space safer, and also considering who's now in the room to facilitate something that is very sensitive and might be culturally specific, it might be gender specific. So you do get intimacy coordinators that also sometimes work as a team. You get intimacy coordinators that work with transgender consultants or BDSM consultants. So it is sometimes a merge of different roles coming together.
Yeah, right. Obviously, we're doing this for the Woman with a Movie Camera Summit, so we have an all-female panel. But are there many men working in the field of intimacy coordinating?
There are actually, there are more now. David Thackeray was one of the first to start working as a male intimacy coordinator, and also Enrique Ortuño, that he's also Spanish, so brings a different culture with him. There's more and more, so, and also people of color. So Joshua, Lizzy is
Joshua Okpala. So he's working with me on Bridgerton season 2, which is really exciting, and he's doing lots of different work at the moment. So it's really exciting to see not only a man, but someone as also a Black intimacy coordinator. I think is just it's an incredible perspective to have, and incredibly useful. And you know, we're just going to see more and more.
I don't want to like end on a particularly negative note, but you know, we know that sexual harassment and abuse is still very prevalent in the film industry. We've seen that time and again. If you don't have experience of auditioning or being on a film set, you don't necessarily know what's acceptable and what isn't. So Vanessa, how does your role help to explain, how do, you know, new up and coming actors who don't have that experience, how are they able to find out what should be going on in those, you know, on set, etc.?
Yeah, I think the first thing that you raised is really interesting there about just from the audition process itself. So there is lots of guidance around. And so, for example, the Directors UK guidance on simulated sex and nudity does actually specifically say in that there should never be a naked audition that's required. I think that's really important particularly for young performers to know that. And that actually, if you're ever going for an audition, that you should you might be asked at a late stage of an audition to go down to bikini briefs or trunks, and that you also have the right to request a chaperone to be in the room with you, which I think is it's obviously really important that you've got that there in the space just to help you feel particularly comfortable. So, I mean, it's about training as well. And a lot of us are doing training in institutions with young actors, telling them what their rights are, explaining what those rights are, and also taking them through what they can expect when they come out into this industry and they are having to do an intimate scene for the first time. Particularly because previously in drama schools, we were excellent at training our actors to move, breathe, walk, go really in depth on character. But we totally left aside how a character kisses or how the character has sex. Mm-hmm. So then you've got a young actor who comes out after a 3-year degree program, and their first scene their first show might include an intimate scene. So it's really important that we've prepared them appropriately during their actual actor training for when they come out the other side of that.
Yeah.
There's lots of advocacy that they can look at. I know myself and Yarit worked on Equity Intimacies Working Group guidelines, so that are available for actors to look at. There is advice for performers there. Ita's obviously got her guidelines for intimacy on set. So there's lots of literature that's available for people to have a look at if direct training might not be immediately available. Or they're taking a job tomorrow, what do I look for, that kind of thing. Obviously we're always going to say bring in an intimacy coordinator.
Yes.
That's always going to be something that we're going to say, but again, just in terms of from the actor perspective, there's lots of tools out there, and we try to make them as available as possible.
Going back to drama schools, absolutely, as I said, for me, that the beginning of developing the work and subsequently the intimacy on set guidelines came from being asked to teach at Mount View at a drama school. But what has happened is that the students have become empowered, and then I would have situations where a visiting director would come in and they'd say, okay, so this is a 1970s play, want to grab a breast, slap a buttock, and then she just expect them to go for it. And the director and the actors were going, okay, now we want the intimacy guidelines. Now we want to go through agreement and consent of touch and a clear choreography. And I got emailed by the head of the course saying, are these actors not using this as an excuse not to be brave?
Oh, wow.
I know. So which led me to understand that actually it's not enough to just teach the staff, just teach the students. What we need to be doing is teaching the staff.
That's probably worth mentioning too, that the number of resources that have been collected by BEC2. A lot of this is all captured in one place as well, with a number of sources. I don't know if you want to talk to that.
Yeah, the BEC2 Intimacy Coordinators branch has a page on the website regarding industry guidelines. We collected all the guidelines that have been created either by unions around the worldwide or by private companies. So producers can go online and look at all the guidelines that they want, also depending on which country they're shooting in. They might want to have a bit of a look at what that country, where is their status regarding understanding around intimacy scenes. The BEC2 branch is also looking at creating a grading scheme, which Vanessa knows more about than I do, because she's the head of the working group. And hopefully by September, we are looking to have a recommended rate card for intimacy coordinators and basic terms and conditions, which will help producers and directors have some sort of an understanding of, if we want to hire someone, what is the recommended rate? Obviously, individuals will have their own terms and conditions or their own kind of rates that they will charge, but at least that gives a kind of trampoline to jump from.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good note to end on, because people can go out and read these for themselves and really understand it. Although hopefully from our conversation, I'm pretty sure our audience has a very kind of good understanding now of intimacy coordination. Thank you so much, Yarit, Lizzy, Vanessa, Ita. That was so illuminating. And thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of this very, very special summit. Have a great night. Thank you again. Goodbye.